Good evening. I'm Captain Marcus Brooks. After 28 years in the skies, I thought I'd seen every kind of passenger there is. I was wrong. Tonight, let me tell you what happened on Flight 883. David Kessler boarded the red-eye from Houston to Newark just after 11 at night, carrying a single backpack and nothing else, moving through the cabin with the economy of a man who had learned long ago not to take up more space than necessary. He was 42 years old, lean, quiet, in a way that read as guarded rather than shy, with a faint scar along his jawline that most people didn't notice unless they looked twice. He settled into 22A, the window seat, and turned his attention outside, almost immediately, watching the ground crew work beneath the runway lights, with an intensity that seemed disproportionate to the scene itself. Beside him in 22B, a man named Ryan Castellano stretched out with the restless energy of someone who hated red eyes and had already resigned himself to a bad night's sleep. Ryan was a marketing consultant heading to a Monday morning pitch meeting, the kind of person who filled silence, reflexively, uncomfortable with anything that felt like a lull. "Rough one, huh?" Ryan said, gesturing vaguely at the late hour. "Red eyes are the worst. You flying for work or pleasure?" "Work," David said, still watching the runway. Ryan waited a beat for more, got nothing, and tried again a few minutes later as the aircraft pushed back from the gate. "What do you do?" "Consulting," David said, which was technically true, though it told Ryan nothing at all, and David offered no more than that single word before returning his attention to the window, watching the lights of Houston fall away beneath the climbing aircraft. Ryan gave up after a third attempt, muttering something to himself about not everyone needing to be friendly on a flight, and pulled out his phone to scroll until the flight attendants dimmed the cabin lights for the overnight service. He didn't know, and had no way of knowing, that David's silence wasn't unfriendliness at all. It was a habit built across 6 deployments and thousands of hours flying Apache helicopters through some of the most violent weather and hostile conditions the Army had ever asked pilots to fly through. A career that had taught him to conserve words, the way he'd once conserved fuel and altitude, keeping only what mattered and releasing the rest. David had left the Army 4 years earlier, worked briefly as a civilian flight instructor before deciding the classroom wasn't for him, and now consulted quietly for aviation safety firms, evaluating pilot training programs from the ground rather than the cockpit. He still flew occasionally, recreationally, though nothing came close to touching what he'd once done in an Apache during a sandstorm at 200 feet, with rounds coming up from the ground. He didn't talk about that. He'd learned slowly, and at some cost, that most people didn't know what to do with those stories, and he'd stopped offering them. There had been a time early after his discharge when he'd tried to explain some of it to people at parties or on flights just like this one, and he'd watched their faces shift into something between discomfort and performed sympathy, neither of which he wanted from strangers. So he'd stopped. He answered questions with the fewest words that were still technically true, and he let people draw whatever conclusions they wanted about the rest. Most concluded he was simply unfriendly. He'd made a kind of peace with that trait a long time ago, deciding that a stranger's brief judgment mattered far less than his own ability to sit quietly with what he carried. The aircraft leveled off at cruising altitude, the cabin settling into the low hum of an overnight flight, most passengers already drifting toward sleep. Outside the window, far to the northwest, a line of storm clouds had begun building, with a speed the evening forecast hadn't fully anticipated, gathering itself into something considerably larger than the light turbulence advisory that had been issued 3 hours earlier. By 1 in the morning, the storm system that had been quietly intensifying over the plains had grown into something considerably more dangerous than forecasters had predicted at departure. A fast-moving line of severe thunderstorms with embedded turbulence, lightning, and hail, expanding faster than the flight planning models had accounted for hours earlier. In the cockpit, Captain Rosa Delgado and First Officer Ethan Marsh had been monitoring the weather radar carefully for the last 20 minutes, adjusting course twice already to route around the worst of the developing cells. Rosa had flown for 19 years and had weathered storms considerably worse than this one, but something about tonight's system carried an unpredictability that kept her attention locked fully on the radar display, rather than splitting it as she normally might between instruments and conversation. "This cell's building faster than the model predicted," she said, studying the radar's shifting colors. "We need to deviate further south." Ethan, 6 years into his career, and still building the deep, instinctive calm that came only with time, nodded and began coordinating the deviation with air traffic control. His hands moved efficiently across the radio panel, requesting the new heading, reading back the clearance with the practiced clarity of someone who had done this 100 times before, though something in his shoulders had begun to tighten as the radar returns painted an increasingly ugly picture ahead of them. The aircraft banked gently south, avoiding the worst of the visible weather, but the turbulence that reached them anyway was significant. Sharp, jarring drops that sent call bells chiming throughout the cabin as passengers who'd been asleep jolted awake, gripping armrests, some crying out softly in surprise. A beverage cart, not yet secured, rolled several inches before a flight attendant caught it, and somewhere near the back of the cabin, a child began to cry, quickly soothed by a parent who was trying just as hard to hide her own nerves. David, wide awake despite the hour, felt the aircraft's movement with a different kind of attention than the passengers around him. Not fear, but assessment. The same instinct that had once told him hovering an Apache through desert windstorms exactly how much margin he had before conditions crossed from difficult into dangerous. He recognized this pattern of turbulence. It wasn't random. It was structured, building consistent with a storm system that hadn't yet peaked, and something in the rhythm of it told him this particular night still had more coming. At 1:17 in the morning, a bright flash of lightning struck close enough to rattle the cabin windows, and in the same instant, the cockpit's primary flight display flickered, dimmed, and went dark. "We just lost the primary display," Ethan said, his voice climbing half an octave before he caught it and steadied himself. "Captain, primary instruments are down." Rosa's hands moved immediately to the backup systems, years of training, converting alarm into procedure before panic had any room to take hold. "Switching to standby instruments. Call it out with me. Airspeed, altitude, attitude." But Ethan, staring at the darkened primary display, found his voice catching his breath, shortening the sudden loss of the instruments he'd trained on for years, triggering a wave of anxiety that momentarily outran his training. His hands, normally steady, trembled slightly against the yoke. "Ethan," Rosa said sharply, "I need you with me, now." In the cabin, flight attendant Carla Nunez moved quickly down the aisle, reassuring anxious passengers as the aircraft continued its turbulent path. The cockpit's tension, not yet visible to those in the cabin, but felt in every jolt and shudder passing through the fuselage. When the interphone chimed with an urgent request from the cockpit, Carla answered immediately, and what she heard sent her moving fast toward the back of economy. "We need anyone on board with flight instrument experience immediately." Rosa's voice came through tight with controlled urgency. "First officer's overwhelmed, managing backup instruments alone in this weather. I need someone who can read altimeter and airspeed data manually and call it out clearly." Carla scanned the cabin fast, uncertain where to even begin, until her eyes landed on David, wide awake, alert, watching the aircraft's movement with a stillness that stood out sharply against the anxious energy surrounding him. "Sir," she said, crouching beside his row, "do you have any aviation background? The cockpit needs help reading backup instruments." David was already unbuckling his seatbelt. "I flew Apache helicopters for the Army. 6 years combat conditions, instrument only in weather worse than this. Take me up." Ryan, startled, fully awake now, stared at David with an expression caught somewhere between disbelief and shame, the pieces of the last 2 hours rearranging rapidly in his mind. The silence, the watchfulness, the scar along his jaw he'd assumed came from something mundane. He watched David move up the aisle with a steadiness that seemed almost unaffected by the aircraft's continued shuddering, and felt for the first time all night genuinely foolish for every assumption he'd made about the man beside him. Other passengers nearby had begun to piece together fragments of what was happening as well. Murmurs passing row to row, something about the instruments, something about a passenger going up front. A current of quiet unease mixed now with something like cautious hope. An older woman across the aisle gripped her rosary a little tighter and murmured something under her breath, watching the cockpit door close behind David, with an expression that suggested she at least understood exactly what kind of moment this was. Carla led David forward through the tense, jostling cabin to the cockpit door, keying the code with hands that had steadied considerably now that she had something concrete to offer. Rosa glanced back as David entered, taking in his calm posture in under a second, the particular stillness of someone who had faced conditions considerably worse than tonight's storm, and lived to describe them in exactly 0 unnecessary words. "David Kessler," he said, "former Apache pilot, 6 years combat and severe weather instrument flying. Tell me what you need." "Standby altimeter and airspeed indicator," Rosa said, pointing to the small backup gauges tucked into the instrument panel, easy to overlook, but critical in exactly this scenario. "Ethan's overloaded, trying to manage both those and the controls. I need someone calling those numbers out clearly and continuously so he can focus on flying attitude." David positioned himself where Rosa indicated, eyes locking onto the small analog gauges with the same focus he'd once trained on far more chaotic displays inside an Apache's cockpit during actual combat. Copy that. I'll call altitude and airspeed every 5 seconds. You fly, I'll read. The next several minutes unfolded with a precision that gradually replaced panic with rhythm. David's voice steady and clear over the noise of the storm, calling numbers with the exact cadence he'd once used, communicating with door gunners and ground troops through headset static and gunfire. Altitude 36.8 holding, airspeed 280 steady. His voice carried no urgency, only clarity. Each number delivered with the same measured calm, regardless of what the aircraft did beneath them. Small drop coming, altitude 36.5 recovering, airspeed 275. Ethan, hearing the numbers called with such consistent steadiness, felt something in his own chest begin to loosen, the anxiety that had briefly overwhelmed him, finding a foothold again in the rhythm David provided. He glanced sideways once, taking in the stranger's calm profile, and found himself matching his own breathing to the pace of David's voice without consciously deciding to. "You're doing fine," David added without breaking his count. "This storm's rough, but it's not the worst I've flown through, not close. Trust your instruments, trust your training." Altitude 36.6, climbing slightly, airspeed 278. Rosa flew with both hands firmly on the controls, her attention fully devoted to attitude and heading, freed from having to split her focus toward the backup gauges thanks to David's steady narration. The aircraft continued through pockets of severe turbulence. Each jolt met not with panic in the cockpit, but with the same unbroken rhythm of numbers. David's voice, a kind of anchor holding the entire flight deck together through conditions that would have tested even seasoned crews operating without the extra set of trained eyes he provided. "How long have you been doing this?" Ethan asked at one point, voice steadier now, more curious than afraid. "Long enough that this isn't the scariest thing I've had happen in a cockpit," David said. "Keep flying. You're doing exactly what you should be doing." 12 minutes into the emergency, the storm's worst cell finally passed behind them, the turbulence easing from violent to merely rough, and Rosa allowed herself the first full breath she'd taken since the primary display had gone dark. "We're through the worst of it," she said. "David, thank you. I don't know what the next 10 minutes would have looked like without you in here." Ethan glanced back at David with an expression that carried something more complicated than simple gratitude. Relief, certainly, but also a kind of humbled recognition, the awareness that a stranger pulled from coach had steadied him in a way his own training in that specific moment hadn't quite managed alone. "I've run instrument failure drills a dozen times in the simulator," he said quietly. "It never once felt like that." "Simulators can't replicate the real thing pulling at your chest," David said. "Nobody's numbers are perfect the first time weather actually tries to kill you. That's not a knock on you. That's just what real is." He kept his eyes on the backup gauges, even as he spoke, unwilling to let his own attention slip until the aircraft was fully clear. "Altitude steady now, 37,000 holding. Airspeed's level 2. You've got this from here if you want it." "I want it," Ethan said, and for the first time since the display had gone dark, his voice carried something closer to its usual confidence. With the storm's most dangerous cell behind them, Rosa coordinated with air traffic control to confirm a clear path toward Newark, the backup instruments continuing to function reliably, even as maintenance crews on the ground were alerted to the primary display failure, awaiting inspection once the aircraft landed. David remained in the cockpit another 10 minutes at Rosa's request, continuing to call out readings as a precaution, while Ethan's confidence steadily rebuilt itself under the weight of the crisis they'd just survived together. "I froze," Ethan admitted quietly, once the immediate danger had passed. "For a few seconds there, I completely froze." "You didn't freeze," David said. "You hesitated for a handful of seconds under conditions that would rattle plenty of pilots with a lot more hours than you've got. The difference between a good pilot and a bad one isn't whether you ever feel that moment. It's what you do the second after it, and you came back. That's what matters." Rosa nodded in agreement, glancing at Ethan with something between reassurance and quiet pride. "He's right. Every pilot I respect has a story like tonight somewhere in their logbook. The good ones just don't let it define them." "For what it's worth," David added, "the fact that you can sit here now and name exactly what happened to you, instead of pretending it didn't, tells me you'll be fine. I've flown with guys who never got that far. They're the ones you actually have to worry about." He glanced toward the darkened primary display still awaiting inspection once they landed. "Instruments fail. Weather turns worse than forecast. That's not a story about you being unprepared. That's just Tuesday some weeks in this job." Ethan managed something close to a real laugh, the first since the emergency had begun, and the small release of tension seemed to settle the whole cockpit a degree further. David eventually returned to the cabin, the immediate crisis resolved, the aircraft now flying smoothly through clearing skies toward Newark. As he made his way back to seat 22A, passengers who'd overheard fragments of what had happened watched him with open curiosity, murmurs of gratitude and quiet respect, following him down the aisle in a way that felt entirely unfamiliar to a man who had spent years actively avoiding exactly this kind of attention. Ryan, still sitting in 22B, looked up as David reclaimed his seat, clearly searching for the right words and not quite finding them immediately. "You flew Apache helicopters," Ryan said finally, half question, half statement, still processing it. 6 years, David said, settling back into his seat, some of the day's tension visibly draining from his shoulders now that the emergency had passed. "And you just helped fly this plane through that storm." "I read some numbers out loud," David said. "The crew did the actual flying. I just gave them one less thing to think about." The remainder of the flight passed smoothly, the storm now well behind them, the cabin gradually settling back into the quiet rhythm of an overnight flight, nearing its final approach. As Flight 883 began its descent into Newark, Rosa's voice came over the intercom, warmer and more personal than a standard cockpit announcement usually allowed. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Delgado. About 40 minutes ago, we experienced a significant weather event that resulted in a temporary loss of our primary flight instruments. I want to personally thank a passenger in seat 22A, David Kessler, a former Army Apache helicopter pilot, whose calm and expertise in our cockpit made a real difference tonight. Mr. Kessler, on behalf of this entire crew, thank you for your service both years ago and about 40 minutes ago." A ripple of applause spread through the cabin passengers, turning to look toward row 22, where David sat with the same quiet discomfort he'd carried through most of the flight, unused to being seen this clearly by people he'd never intended to know his name. At the gate in Newark, Rosa stepped out of the cockpit to shake David's hand personally as passengers filed past. "I've flown almost 20 years, she said. "Tonight's near the top of the list for weather I've dealt with. Having you in that cockpit made the difference between a controlled emergency and something considerably worse. I mean that. You and your first officer did the actual work," David said. "I just gave you a clearer picture to work with." "That's usually how the people who matter most describe it," Rosa said, echoing a sentiment she'd heard from more than one quiet hero across 19 years of flying. Small like it was nothing. It wasn't nothing. She glanced back toward the cockpit door, where maintenance crews had already begun their initial inspection of the failed display. "I'll be filing a full report on tonight, and your name's going in it, whether you want the attention or not. Aviation's a small enough world that this won't just disappear." "I figured," David said with something almost like resignation, though not entirely without warmth. "I've never been much for the spotlight. But if it means the next crew that runs into something like this has one more data point to learn from, I can live with it." Ethan approached as well, extending his hand with a steadiness that hadn't been there an hour earlier. "I want you to know what you said back there about hesitating not being the same as freezing. I'm going to carry that with me for a long time." "Good," David said. "You'll need it again someday. Everyone in this job does eventually. What matters is, you'll remember you came back from it once already." Ryan lingered near his row as the aisle slowly cleared, finally approaching David with none of his earlier restless energy. "I spent the first 2 hours of this flight thinking you were rude for not talking to me," he said. "I'm sorry for that. I had no idea what you were carrying, or what you were capable of." "I don't usually lead with the helicopter thing," David said, allowing himself a small, tired smile. "Doesn't usually come up over small talk about red eyes." "Fair enough," Ryan said. "For what it's worth, I run a marketing firm that works with a lot of veteran-owned businesses. If you're ever looking for that kind of connection, I'd be glad to help." David considered the offer, tucking Ryan's card into his backpack alongside a boarding pass he'd probably keep longer than he needed to. "I'll think about it," he said, and meant it more than he expected to when he'd boarded this flight, 11 hours behind him. He shouldered his bag and made his way up the jet bridge into the Newark terminal, the storm and the silence both behind him, now carrying forward instead something he hadn't expected to find on an ordinary red-eye. A reminder that the quietest people on a flight are sometimes the ones holding it together, whether anyone around them ever finds out or not. Somewhere behind him, Ethan was already telling Rosa he wanted to log the details of tonight properly, not to bury the moment he'd stumbled, but to remember exactly how he'd found his way back from it, in case some future version of himself needed the reminder more than he did tonight. "I've flown with first officers who panicked at far less than what hit us tonight in the story, and I've sat behind veterans who said nothing for hours and turned out to be the calmest, steadiest presence in the entire aircraft when the moment actually came. At 35,000 feet, everyone wears the same seatbelt. It's character, not how much someone talks about themselves, that truly separates us. If this story moved you, subscribe, and I'll see you on the next flight.